Have you ever wondered what the new covenant is all about? And have you ever considered that there's actually an old covenant? The Bible talks about an everlasting covenant as well. What's going on here? What's the difference between the old covenant and the new covenants? Would you be surprised if I told you that it was all about God and Israel getting married? Yeah, it's actually true. You see, when we actually look through the text, what we find is that God and Israel, they got married. So we're going to take a look at that. We see here that what we see is that God and Israel got married. It says, "Then those of you who escape will remember me among the nations, because I was crushed by their adulterous heart, which is departed from me, and by their eyes, which play the harlot after their idols." So here God is speaking to the southern kingdom of Judah, and he's talking about how he had married them. They were adulterous. Ezekiel chapter 16 verse 8 is even clearer. I want to show this to you. He says, "When I passed by you again and looked upon you, indeed your time was the time of love. So I spread my wing over you and covered your nakedness. Yes, I swore an oath to you and entered into a covenant with you, and you became mine, says the Lord." Well, God goes on and he says, "You are an adulterous wife who takes strangers instead of her husband." And then in 16:38, "And I will judge you as women who break wedlock or shed blood are judged. I will bring blood upon you in fury and jealousy." And as a second witness, we have in Jeremiah 3 verse 20, God says, "Surely as a wife treacherously departs from her husband, so you have dealt treacherously with me, O house of Israel, says the Lord." Now we're going to take a look at some more scriptures, but I wanted to show you that God and Israel got married. And just as we saw, God said that he entered into a covenant with Israel and she became his. So when we understand this whole idea of a marriage or a covenant, he's talking about a marriage covenant. So this study is all about God's divorce and his remarriage. Now again, this might seem like a big shock. What are you talking about, Doug? This is impossible. God can't get divorced. He just doesn't do that. Well, he did though. He actually married Israel, and then he divorced Israel because she was unfaithful. Hey, by the way, my name is Doug Hamp. You can check me out at douglashamp.com. You can also look at my videos on youtube.com/DougHamp. So let's get started. The study of God's divorce and remarriage. Well, you got the wedding vows, right? It was at Mount Sinai. After God had slayed the dragon, he'd gone through dale and over mountains to get his wife Israel, this damsel in distress who was back in Egypt. He went and he saved her, and now he has taken her. He took her to Mount Sinai, and there he proposed, said, "Will you be mine?" And he says, "If you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine." What God is saying is, look, you're going to be my special sugar plum. You're going to be my honey bun. You're going to be my sugar, my sweetheart. And all this stuff is what he's saying. You're going to be my special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. These are terms of endearment. What God is doing here is he's proposing, he's asking Israel to be his wife. And what Moses tells us in Deuteronomy, he says, "Yehovah your God has chosen you to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all the peoples on the face of the earth." So Moses is just reiterating what God did back there in Exodus chapter 19. Moses goes on to say, "Yehovah did not set his love on you, nor choose you because you are more in number than any other people, for you are the least of all peoples." All right, let's take a break right there. So, first of all, we said that Yehovah did not set his love on you, nor choose you because you are more in number than any other people. So God loves Israel. And he didn't do it because they were the best or the strongest or the most numerous. Not at all. They're actually this kind of this damsel in distress, this idea. And he says, but because Yehovah loves you, and because he would keep the oath which he swore to your fathers, Yehovah has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of bondage, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So again, Moses is retelling the story that God went down to Egypt. He got the damsel in distress out of harm's way. He got her away from that terrible dragon, and he took her then into the wilderness and said, will you be mine? And he says, I'm going to bless you. And of course, what does she say? She says, yes. Now, this recording of the vows is in the book of the covenant. The book of the covenant is from Exodus chapter 20 through 23. So it's a mere 4 chapters. And it kind of gives the ideas of what you're supposed to do in the marriage. It's basically the obligations that each party has in the marriage. Today we would call this our vows. I, Doug, promise to love you with all my heart until death do us part and all that stuff, right? Well, that's essentially what's happening here. God says, I'm going to bless you, I'm going to take care of you, I'm going to provide for you, etc. And Israel's response is, all that the Lord has said, we will do. And God said, look, I want you to keep my 10 commandments. These are these 10 important things that I really think are important. And by the way, here's a little bit of explanation as to what all of these mean. What does it mean to murder? What does it mean to steal? And he gives the explanation. And they said, yes, we will do it. This is very much like a ketubah. That's basically a Jewish marriage contract. All right, as a ketubah, you can see one here on your screen. That is a modern ketubah between 2 people here that have decided to get married. And so there Moses is sealing this, he's ratifying this. Then Moses took the book of the covenant and read in the hearing of the people. Now obviously it doesn't take Moses to do this. God can do it. Moses is simply one of the witnesses. He's sort of the minister, if you will, who is kind of officiating this wedding, if you will. And so here we have a marriage contract with prenuptial agreements in case of infidelity. So the terms and conditions were Yehovah's 10 words, his 10 commandments, which he gave for Israel's good. And it says, and now Israel, what does Yehovah your God require of you? But to fear Yehovah your God, to walk in all his ways, and here it is, look at, and to love him, to serve Yehovah your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and to keep the commandments of Yehovah and his statutes, which I command you today for your good. Now this isn't too much to ask, is it? When you get married, maybe you're married already, remember that day, or maybe you're looking forward to this, don't you want your wife or your husband to love you with everything they've got? That's what we all dream of, right? I mean, that's what a good marriage should look like. And that's what God is asking Israel to do. Love me with everything you've got. But of course, he can't make her love him. He can only ask her, he can beg her, he can persuade her, but he can't make her do it. That's a decision that she'll have to make. Just like you can't make your boyfriend, your girlfriend, or your spouse actually love you. You can only give them every reason to love you, but you can't actually make them love you. And that's what God is doing here as well. So we have a marriage contract, just like we saw there in Ezekiel chapter 16. He says, I entered into a covenant with you, and you became mine. This happened at Mount Sinai. God took Israel to be his lawfully wedded wife. And Israel's response was, I do. All that Yehovah has said, we will do, and be obedient. So you've told your fiance, before you ask her, you get down on one knee, you say, will you marry me? I promise to be faithful to you. Will you be faithful to me? And she says, I do. So here you have it. And all Israel needed to do was to love God, to love him by remaining faithful to him. Yehovah also promised that if they would be faithful, then Israel would be a special treasure to him above all people, For all the earth is mine, he says, or in Exodus 19:5. So their marriage contract, it was cut. That's the Hebrew word there, karat brit, which literally means to cut a deal. That's where we get that term, to cut a deal, is from the Bible. So the contract was cut and the vows were ratified with blood. And Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, "This is the blood of the covenant which Jehovah has made with you according to all these words." So today what we would do is we'd both sign on the dotted line, and we'd have 2 or 3 witnesses there that are watching this. It might be in front of the county clerk, it might be in front of a pastor or whoever, and then that is actually mailed in to the county courthouse or to the clerk, and then it's put on file, and now it's official because it has witnesses and it's on public record. Well, the same thing happened here with God's marriage to Israel. It has witnesses, it has blood, it has been sealed, it's been signed, and now it's completely official. Well, the unfortunate part is that Israel was not faithful to her husband. Now, when I talk about Israel, of course, I'm talking about the 12 tribes of Israel. I'm not just talking about the tribe of Judah. I'm talking about all 12 tribes, all right, the united Israel. So, united Israel, the 12 tribes, were not faithful from the very beginning, which is very, very sad. As you recall the story of the golden calf, you might say on their wedding night, she was already out looking after these other gods and already two-timing. I mean, think about how your heart would be broken. You've asked your girlfriend to marry you. She says yes. The big day comes. You guys exchange vows, and it's the most beautiful, wonderful day of your life. And then you discover that she's off behind the water cooler with an old fling. And you're like, what in the world is going on here? All right. And you think, man, I could divorce her right now because she's been unfaithful. She's broken the covenant. But then you say to yourself, you know what? She came from a rough home. She didn't have the best upbringing, not the best education. I still love her. And I'm just going to overlook this thing. That's essentially what God did. Well, time goes on, and Israel continues to be a two-timer, and God is constantly calling them back to him, until eventually God tells Solomon that because of his unfaithfulness, that he's going to tear the kingdom from him, and he's going to give it to his servant Rehoboam. To Jeroboam. There we go. So He takes it, but because of his servant David, he's going to keep 2 tribes for the southern kingdom of Judah, but the 10 tribes are going to go to the kingdom of Israel in the north, and so basically all of Israel is then given to Jeroboam. So we see here, it says, when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, the prophet Ahiah the Shilonite met him on the way, and he had clothed himself with a new garment, and the 2 were alone in the field. Then Ahiah took hold of the new garment that was on him and tore it into 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, "Take for yourself 10 pieces, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. Behold, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon and give 10 tribes to you. But he shall have 1 tribe for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel." So, obviously, David comes from Judah, so that is his own tribe. And then he has 1 more tribe, which is going to be the tribe of Benjamin. So there's 2 tribes, and then, of course, we have the Levites. They're floaters. They don't have their own particular land, so they're kind of out and about. And so they're, it's 2 tribes, plus you have the floaters of the Levites. And he goes on, he says, "Because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Milcom, the god of the people of Ammon." These were awful gods, by the way. They would have all kinds of temple prostitution, and then of course you have little babies that come as a result of that, and then they would dispose of those babies in very unpleasant ways. And so this is greatly offensive. Solomon was one of the ringleaders of this. You can read about that in Scripture, that Solomon was worshiping these false gods, and we know from history that they were killing, murdering, sacrificing children to these false gods. And so naturally that is going to upset God, right? So God says, and they've not walked in my ways to do what is right in my eyes and keep my statutes and my judgments, as did his father David. However, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, because I have made him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of my servant David, whom I chose because he kept my commandments and my statutes. So God says, look, Solomon, it's over for you. I'm taking the kingdom. I'm going to give it to Jeroboam because you have done wickedness in my sight. But because I love David and he was faithful and I made promises to him, I'll let you keep, Judah plus Benjamin. So otherwise, forget it. It's over. So he says, but I will take the kingdom out of his son's hand and give it to you, 10 tribes. Speaking here to Jeroboam. And to his son I will give one tribe, that my servant David may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen for myself, to put my name there. So I will take you, and you shall reign over all your heart desires, and you shall be king over Israel. So this happened in about 932 BC. This is when we go from the united monarchy to the divided kingdom. We go from just having the one kingdom of Israel to now 2 houses, and in the south it becomes known as the house of Judah, and in the north it becomes known as the house of Israel. This is an incredibly important distinction. If you miss this, much of the Bible is going to be unintelligible. But if you get this, then it's going to fill in the blanks like you wouldn't believe. So keep that in mind. I will point this out again as we go through our study, but this is very, very important that you now have 2 houses, you have 2 nations, and God is going to divorce himself from one of those 2 nations. Now we read later in Ezekiel 23 about 2 daughters who are from one mother who both practice harlotry. And he says, Son of man, there were 2 women, the daughters of one mother. They committed harlotry in Egypt. They committed harlotry in their youth. Their names Oholah the elder and Oholibah her sister. They were mine, and they bore sons and daughters. Now remember, God said in Ezekiel 16 that I found you, you are naked, I clothed you, and I entered into a covenant with you, and you were mine. He's speaking there about the united kingdom, the 12 tribes. He married one wife which consisted of the 12 tribes. Okay, so we're talking about the united kingdom of Israel. That is what he married back at Mount Sinai. And now, in 932 is when we see that the kingdom splits. And then later, he has to deal with each of them individually. So now he's calling them both sisters. They're both daughters of one mother. That one mother is the mother that he married in the wilderness. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. So now we're looking at, instead of one united kingdom, we're looking at 2 houses, Oholah and Oholibah. And he says, they were mine, they bore sons and daughters. As for their names, Samaria is Oholah, and Jerusalem is Oholibah. Now, Samaria is the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, and Jerusalem is the capital of the southern kingdom of Judah. Very important. So, Jeroboam founded Samaria in the north for the kingdom of Israel, and of course we know that David was the one who founded Jerusalem for the southern kingdom of Judah. But of course when David founded Jerusalem, it wasn't 2 nations, it was only one. All right, so again, keep that in mind. That's a very important clue. Oholah played the harlot even though she was mine, And she lusted for her lovers, the neighboring Assyrians. Thus she committed her harlotry with them, all of them choice men of Assyria, and with all for whom she lusted, with all their idols, she defiled herself. So he's talking about the northern kingdom of Israel, that they were all googly-eyed over the Assyrians. Now, the Assyrians came in 722 BC, and they destroyed and took away the northern kingdom of Israel. Very, very important on your timeline. All right, so the first marriage contract is that God and Israel got married at Sinai. It was a united Israel. But then they split in 932 BC, and then we're going to see that God is going to divorce himself from the northern kingdom, not from the southern kingdom, but from the northern kingdom. I'm going to show you the scriptures in just a moment. Notice here in Hosea 2:2, Yehovah stated that northern Israel, he said, is not my wife, nor am I her husband. So again, Yehovah can only get divorced if he'd been once married, right? You can't get divorced from somebody that you never married. But if you're married, then you can get divorced. And he tells us right here in plain sight, Jeremiah 3:8, speaking to the northern kingdom. He says, then I saw that for all the causes for which backsliding Israel had committed adultery, I put her away and given her a certificate of divorce. Yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, but went and played the harlot also. Now notice here, there's two different houses. These are the two sisters, Samaria and Jerusalem, or Oholah and Oholibah. And he's only divorcing Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel. He's not divorcing the southern kingdom of Israel, or of Judah, excuse me. Now, does the southern kingdom of Judah deserve it? Of course she does. I mean, she's awful. She does play the harlot also, he says. But he didn't divorce her. So the covenant that God made with was Israel because he was her husband. In Jeremiah 31:32, it says, the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day that I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, though I was a husband to them, says Yehovah. So again, we see that God and United Kingdom of Israel got married at Mount Sinai. And God entered into a covenant with Israel. I hope you're seeing by now that the so-called Old Covenant, that first covenant, is a marriage contract. It's a marriage contract. And there was nothing wrong with the conditions of the contract. There was nothing wrong with the one who gave the contract. The problem was with the adulterous wife who decided she didn't want to keep it. And what happened, it's not just that, individuals committed murder here and there, or that individuals stole from one another here and there. No. It was far more grievous than that. It's that she promised to be faithful to her husband and to not have any other gods before him. Think of it like this. You get married and you say, listen, sweetheart, I know you had a lot of guys on your Facebook, but I feel a little bit uncomfortable. Can you just have my picture on Facebook? You're like, of course, sweetheart, right? But before you know it, you've got all these guy friends on there, or if you're a guy, then you have all these old girlfriends on there, and you're like, well, it's just for fun, etc. And yet, it's not. Or you have all these, these previous flings in your phone. Or, you're constantly going to places where you used to meet with your previous boyfriends or girlfriends, right? That's the basis here that's happening, is that it's not just that somebody left a toilet seat up. It's not just that, hey, you burned my toast. No, it's that you're two-timing. The very heart and soul of our relationship is that we promise to be exclusive to one another. That is the very thing that you're breaking. And that's what Israel did to God, both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And so what happens is that God finally says, enough is enough. He says that to the northern kingdom, and he says, I'm going to divorce her. So he gives a certificate of divorce, and it was after 700 painstaking years of northern Israel's backsliding and adultery that Yehovah put her away and gave her a certificate of divorce. Talk about patient. Over 700 years where God sent prophet after prophet to ask her to come back to me, I still love you, we'll work it out, I'll find a way, but come back to me so I don't have to divorce you. Well, we know what happened. She didn't. So therefore Yehovah was very angry with Israel and removed them from his sight, and there was none left but the tribe of Judah alone, or Judah and, of course, Benjamin in the south. So we have the kingdom of the house of Judah still existing in the south, but we don't have any longer the kingdom of the house of Israel in the north because they've been taken away. And this verse here tells us very clearly that they were taken away. So their divorce now creates this divine dilemma. So it created a seemingly unsolvable dilemma because according to God's own instructions in Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4, a husband cannot take back his wife who has been with another husband who has also sent her away or died. That would be an abomination, God tells us. He says here, if the latter husband detests her and writes her a certificate of divorce, here's the Hebrew word kritut. Kritut is the same word as karat, and it means to cut. Just like karat brit, to cut a deal. It means, in the case of God and Israel getting married, they cut an animal, and that was sealing the deal, cutting the deal. Here's the word kritut. It means to cut. It's divorcing. It's separating. That's what a knife does. It cuts things. It separates them. Right? So a certificate of separation, of divorce, puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house. There's the word is shlicha. Or if the latter husband dies who took her as his wife, then the former husband, in this case it's Yehovah, who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before Yehovah. So there you have it. God married Israel, United Kingdom. In 932, the kingdom split. In 722, God declared, you're no longer my wife. I'm no longer your God. It's over. Here's your certificate of divorce. Get out of my house. And that's when the Assyrians came and took her away. So there you have it. God says, I'm divorcing you. It's over. So it seems that there's no hope for northern Israel. There was no conceivable hope for northern Israel to return to a marriage covenant with Yehovah, or for Judah and Israel to ever reunite. Now, reconciliation with her groom would, according to Yehovah's own commandments, result in abomination and the land becoming defiled. Nevertheless, Yehovah passionately called his wayward wife to return, that is, repent, to him, and presumably he would have to find a way to work things out, all right? And he's God. He's pretty good at that, right? So we find that in Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 6, God is now, of course, Jeremiah is speaking for God, and God says, they say, all right? So God is now quoting what people are saying, all right? And he says, they say, if a man divorces his wife, and she goes from him and become another man's wife, may he return to her again. Would not that land be greatly polluted? But you have played the harlot with many lovers. Yet return, shuvi is the word, shuvi elai, to me, says Yehovah. Yehovah said also to me in the days of Josiah the king, that's in the south, have you seen what backsliding Israel, in the north, has done? She has gone up on every high mountain and under every green tree, and there played the harlot. And I said after she had done all these things, Shuvi elai, return to me, but she did not return. She did not repent. And her treacherous sister Judah in the south saw it. Then I saw that for all the causes for which backsliding Israel had committed adultery, and I'd put her away and given her a certificate of divorce, yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, but went and played the harlot also. And yet for all this, her treacherous sister Judah has not turned to me with her whole heart, but in pretense, says Yehovah. Now keep in mind that when Jeremiah is writing, we're now coming up really close to the end of the southern kingdom of Judah. Nebuchadnezzar came, and in three different waves. First he came in 605, then 597 BC, and finally in 586 BC. And in the last campaign against Jerusalem, he razed the city to the ground, he destroyed the temple, and he took away the rest of the cream of the crop over to Babylon. So in the days of Jeremiah, we're getting really close to the end of Judah. Well, what about the northern kingdom of Israel? Where are they? They are not up there. They're not there. They've been replaced. The king of Assyria had a policy that he would take people from neighboring countries that he had conquered, and he would put them into a different country. So the people from country A, the captives, got transferred to the area of country B, and the people from B went over to country A. And so now you have what we know as the Samaritans. They're now a mixed breed. Again, he didn't take all of the Israelites away, the northern kingdom, but he took most of them away. And so now you begin having this mixed bag. All right? So he says, then Yehovah said to me, backsliding Israel has shown herself more righteous than treacherous Judah. Go and proclaim these words toward the north. All right, so look, Jeremiah is now being given a message to the northern kingdom of Israel that is not there. All right, he's saying, look, Judah, who's still existing at that time, is really awful. But now speak to the north. But they're not there. That's the trouble. They've already been taken away. It's been 130 years approximately, 140 years that they've been out. They've been gone. And yet God is saying, return, shuv, shuvi, backsliding Israel. Says Yehovah, I will not cause my anger to fall on you, for I am merciful, says Yehovah. I will not remain angry forever. This is the heart and the soul of the gospel, is to return because God has made a way for you to come back into the kingdom. All right, so that is kind of a little bit of a foreshadow to the new covenant we're going to talk about really soon. But right now we're still looking at the old covenant. And I want you to understand here that the old covenant is not just that God had these do's and don'ts, and in the new covenant all of that stuff is done away with. That's not true. That is just not true. The covenant has to do with the marriage covenant, the marriage contract between Yehovah, God, and Israel. And then we have this divorce, and now we've got this problem. How do you get God and his wife back together without breaking the law? So he says, God says, only acknowledge your iniquity, that you have transgressed against Yehovah your God, and have scattered your charms to alien deities under every green tree, and you have not obeyed my voice, says Yehovah. Return, O backsliding children, says Yehovah, for I am married to you. That is Baalti. That's the kind of a pun in that word there. The word Baal, of course, is Baal in English. So the false god Baal, and they were going after the Baalim, after the Baals of the land, and they were constantly giving their adoration and their worship and their allegiance and their love to this god instead of to the one true God who actually married her. And he says, look, I am married to you. I am married, Baalti. He says, I'm the one who's your husband, your Baal, okay, really. And I will take you, one from a city and two from a family, and I will bring you to Zion. So God has a plan to get Israel back, talking of the northern kingdom. He's got a plan for the southern kingdom too. We're going to look at that as well, of course. So the divine solution, the way to reverse the curse, we have to ask ourselves the question, how could Israel be brought back into a marriage covenant without Yehovah violating his own law? Again, Deuteronomy 24, 4a, then her former husband, Yehovah, who divorced her, Israel, must not take her, Israel, back to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before Yehovah. So it's absolutely impossible, according to the law, for God to just take her back. Even though he's saying, come on back to me, she can't just come on back. She can't do that. And that's why God even says, they say that if a man has a wife and he divorces her, can she come back? Of course not. The land would be defiled. But he says, even for all that, come on back to me. And again, this is what's so amazing, is that God had a plan. And this is the big mystery that the prophets of old, and probably the angels too, were looking into and saying, how in the world is God going to do this? It seems absolutely impossible. So the only way that the wife, that is the northern kingdom of Israel, could be released of her fate of having been put away, the shlicha, and divorced, the kritut, was for Yehovah, her husband, to die, which would annul and dissolve the original marriage contract. Well, that seems like a fat chance, right? I mean, if you're married to God, if the only way to be released from that marriage contract is for your husband to die, and your husband happens to be God, and God doesn't die, what are you going to do? You're pretty much, out of luck. You're out of hope. There's nothing that can happen. But is that really the case? Well, it sure seemed that way. It sure seemed like there was no hope. There was nothing that could happen. And then, of course, one day, everything changed. And the Apostle Paul got very excited about this when he kind of put the pieces together. He said, do you realize what's happening here? Do you realize the magnitude of what has just happened? Let me explain this thing to you. So he understood that when using the law to explain, he reminded the Jews who knew the law that their law only has jurisdiction over a person until that person's death. All right, so Paul, writing the book of Romans, he's writing to a mixed crowd, to Jews and to non-Jews, right, which we call Gentiles. Gentile is a word coming from Latin gens, and it means peoples. If you look at it in the Greek, it means ethnos, which again just means peoples. And so now it's all coming together. It's how to get these two people back together. Paul then says, or do you not know, brethren, for I speak to those who know the law, that the law has dominion over a man as long as he lives. For a woman who has a husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. But if the husband dies, she's released from the law of her husband. Did you catch that? First of all, Paul says he's speaking to those who know the law. So that's the first very important fact that we have to establish here, is that Paul is writing to those who have an understanding of the law. If you don't have an understanding of the law, then you're going to be a little bit lost as to what Paul is really trying to say. If you know the law, then you're going to go, oh, I get it. I know what Paul's talking about. So Paul then says, for the woman who has a husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. But if the husband dies, she's released from the law of her husband. So he's referring back to Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4. And again, the Jews listening would have said, oh yeah, I know that passage. I know what he's talking about. She's bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. That's what the law says. But then Paul says, but wait, but if the husband dies, she's released from the law of her husband. And of course, everybody would have said, well, of course, that makes perfect sense. Once the guy dies, she's released. That's not a problem. But notice here, it's very important. The law of her husband. Paul is not talking about the law in general. He's talking about the law of her husband. I just can't stress that enough. The law of her husband is what she's released from, not the good instructions that God gave and said, okay, now you can kill, it's okay. Now you can do whatever you feel like. Now you can steal. Now you can bear false witness. Of course you can't do those things. Those are still good. Those are still true. So the thing that she's released from is the law of her husband. And he goes on to explain how the wife is freed from the law of the husband, that is the marriage contract. So then, if while her husband, Yehovah, lives, she, Israel, marries another man, that is the Baal, etc. So again, what he's saying here is, so if while her husband lives, and of course Israel was married to Yehovah, she is if she marries another man, think of the golden calf, Baal, Ashtoreth, Molech, Milcom, and all these false gods, she will be called an adulteress. Now, what did God call her? You're an adulterous wife. You're so adulterous. You're treacherous. He says, but if her husband dies, she's free from that law. Notice, it's that law. It's not, again, the good instructions called the Torah that God gave, but it's this specific contract, so that she is no adulteress, though she has married another man. So again, he's not suggesting that the entire Torah that were given at Sinai, that the laws that God gave at Sinai, he's not saying those are repealed. Not at all. He's saying that the marriage contract that she broke, that she was guilty of breaching, she's now free from that law, the law of the husband, not the Torah in general. That's the huge difference. And Paul's excited about this. He's explaining it to those who know the law. The trouble is, a lot of people come to Romans chapter 7 with zero knowledge of the law, and they start reading it, and they say, well, I know it good enough. Well, they don't. They don't know it because it doesn't make any sense, because they don't know the law. And so then they just think that Paul's coming up with this cute little example, of what Jesus did for us and all this. Well, yeah, I mean, Jesus did this for us, but what does it mean? What is he getting at? He's talking about this marriage that was broken, and now that marriage contract can be laid to rest. He says, therefore, my brethren, you also have become dead to the law. Which law is he talking about? The law of her husband, right? That's called an antecedent. We have to go back and say, well, which law is he talking about? He's already defined it for us, the law of her husband. It says, so you also have become dead to the law of her husband through the body of Christ, that you may be married to another. All right, so what's he getting at here? Jesus is Emmanuel. He is God in the flesh, right? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father, Yeshua says. All right, now again, without getting into the whole hypostatic union and all that stuff, all right, that's for another video. But in this case, all we have to think about is that Jesus is the visible bodily manifestation, visitation of God. He's come and he went to the cross and he died. So he is the husband that died, right? So she was married to Jesus essentially when he went to the cross. And guess what? Her husband died on the cross. So now she's free from that law. She's free from the marriage covenant that she broke. And so then he died. He stayed in the tomb 3 days, right? He was dead. He was out for the count. He didn't come back. But guess what? This other guy rose from the dead. All right? Now, again, I think it's the same Jesus that died, but legally, it's a new guy, okay? I get it. The same Jesus that was nailed to the cross and put in the tomb is the same one that raised from the dead. I'm not saying otherwise. All I'm trying to help articulate here is that from a legal standpoint, when Jesus died and was buried, that broken contract was also buried with him. And when he rose from the dead, it was as if, legally, he was a new guy. So legally, he is a new guy. And now, he's the same personality, he's the same creator, but he's a new guy because the old contract has now been put to rest. That old contract is dead. And now there's a new contract so that he can enter into with his wife this new marriage contract. It's pretty amazing. So again, Paul says, therefore, my brethren, you also have become dead to the law through the body of Christ, that you may be married to another, to him who was raised from the dead. So who is the other? Well, it's Jesus, right? So Jesus died on the cross, so that Jesus, let's call that Jesus 1 and Jesus 2, okay? All right, so Jesus 1 is nailed to the cross. He's then put into the tomb. He's dead. And then Jesus 2 now rises from the dead, and he's like a different Jesus, right? And again, I'm just footnoting here because I'm sure there's somebody that's going to say, well, Doug, you believe in two different gods. No, I don't believe in one God. I believe in the same Jesus, okay, right? The same one that died, rose again. But from a legal standpoint, he's a new entity. He's a new entity from a legal standpoint. So now you're married to another, to him who was raised from the dead, that we should bear fruit to God. But if the husband dies, she's released from the law of her husband. There it is again in Romans 7:2. I put that there just to drive home that point that we're talking about the law of the husband. We're talking about the marriage contract. We're not talking about all the good instructions of don't murder and don't steal, etc. We're not talking about those. Those are simply the things that are on God's heart. And those things are still on God's heart. So the curses of the broken marriage contract died with Yeshua, died with Jesus, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements. So what were these curses? Well, the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us. What was it? Well, in the law it says, look, if you are an adulterer, then you deserve to die. You deserve to be, at the very least, divorced and sent away, and you can never come back. And there's not going to be any relationship. You're forever in exile. That's the good case. That's the good scenario. The bad scenario is that you die. So that was against us. These are certainly handwriting of requirements that's against us, contrary to us. He has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. You see, a lot of people read this and they say, well, the Ten Commandments and all that stuff, God got rid of that. No, you guys, God has kept his Ten Commandments. Those are of utmost importance in God's economy. He's not going to get rid of those. Those are still incredibly significant. He's still against murder. He's still against thievery. He's still against bearing false witness against your neighbor. He's still against adultery. He's still against coveting. He's still for honoring your parents. He's still for keeping the Sabbath, right? He's still for having no other gods before him. He's still for not taking his name in vain, right? I mean, he's still for all of these things. Those are still on his heart. Those have not changed one bit. But yet we've been told this lie that all those things change because those things, those 10 commandments, were nailed to the cross. That is incorrect, to put it nicely. All right, so again, the contract there at the beginning, the first one, was sealed with blood. At the first covenant, cut at Sinai, the book of the covenant, that is the marriage contract, was proclaimed, and then the blood of bulls was sprinkled in order to seal the deal. And that's in the same way how today we sign a contract and then we have it notarized and filed with the city clerk. It's the blood that made the contract effective, operable, and binding. So the contract, again, sealed with blood. Then it says he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said all that Yehovah said we will do and be obedient. And Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant which Yehovah has made with you according to all these words. Again, what words? You can look at it yourself from chapter 20 through chapter 23. It's only 4 chapters. So the blood made the contract effective, operable, and binding. After the people had heard all the conditions of the contract, they said, I do, and gladly accepted the marriage contract with Yehovah. They agreed to be faithful to him and to do all that he had asked them to do, which is what we always do when we enter into an agreement or a contract, right? I mean, that's what you expect. And if somebody doesn't do what is in the contract, you're shocked. Like, well, they didn't keep their end of the bargain, right? And you have to work it out somehow. In the case of marriage, you have to either get counseling or it may dissolve in a divorce. So with the new covenant, this is now the new marriage contract with Jesus, let's just say God, okay, for simplicity, with God who married Israel back at Mount Sinai. She was an adulterous wife. And so God goes on the cross to put that contract into the grave. And now Jesus too, okay, this new husband rises from the dead. And now he can marry the same woman because she's no longer considered an adulteress. She is no longer considered to be under that curse because she broke the covenant. So the blood, Jesus' blood in this case, was offered to seal the deal just like the first covenant. That's why Jesus says, "For this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins." Now, the second marriage contract is, of course, greater than the first. The nature of the blood sacrifice was of immeasurably greater quality than that of the first covenant. Additionally, the one who would officiate the sacrifice would not be Moses, a Levite, but one of the order of Melchizedek. So in this, the husband died to dissolve the old marriage, but at the same time, his blood became the blood of the new covenant, and he also was the one who offered the blood on that heavenly altar that we read about in the book of Hebrews, where it says, "But Christ came as high priest of the good things to come with the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, not with the blood of goats and calves, like it was in the first one, but with his own blood he entered the most holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption." And then Paul tells us in Colossians 1, "And you who once were alienated and enemies in your mind by wicked works, yet now he has reconciled in the body of his flesh through death to present you holy and blameless and above reproach in his sight." So the wife is now free from the curse of the broken marriage covenant. Now free from the curse of her broken marriage covenant, Israel could actually remarry without being called an adulteress. Now, how could she be rejoined to her groom if he was in the grave? Okay, so this, I hope, makes sense here, right? So Jesus dies on the cross, he goes into the tomb, right? So now the stigma of being an adulteress is no longer applicable to her because her husband has died. So you can't be an adulteress if your husband's dead. So for 3 days, Israel, the adulterous wife, has now become a widow because her husband actually died. But that's no fun, because the whole point of what God wanted to do was to not just stay dead so that she could have that stain removed. I mean, that was very important. But the whole point was so he could remarry her, because he made promises to her to come back to him and he would work things out, and that he married her forever and will love her forever. So if Yeshua remained dead, then no remarriage between him and Israel could take place despite her new freedom. Therefore, Yeshua had to not only die to free Israel, but he had to also rise from the dead so that she could remarry her former husband, who was in reality a new husband from a legal standpoint. Pretty exciting when you start to look at this. So now we have a new husband for a new, legally new wife. Without the resurrection, Israel would have been free to marry another, but not to the very one who promised himself to her forever. So now, having risen from the dead, the old husband was actually a new husband. You got to love this. It's almost like those time warp things that you see in movies. They're like, whoa, how does this all work? Well, this is what Paul and others were trying to explain how cool this was, because it really is very, very cool. So all of the lawlessness, that is her adultery, that was committed in the first marriage, was literally buried with Yeshua, the husband, Yehovah in the flesh. And now he was free to remarry his former wife without breaking his own laws or his own instructions. So his new marriage would be a new marriage contract, a new covenant, a new testament with Israel. Not with this other thing that people call the church. Okay, now I know the word church is in the Bible. I understand that. In the Greek it's ekklesia, in the Hebrew it's kehillah, and it just means an assembly, a group of people. In this case, the group of people is Israel, because that's who God married in the first place. That's who God said that he would be faithful to her forever, even if she was unfaithful. This is the one that God said, I will always love you, and I will never abandon you, no matter what. So how does he do it? It's through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And again, this is why Paul is so excited, and he's sharing in his epistles. For example, in Ephesians 2:11 through 13, he's talking about the house of Israel. Remember, there's two houses. You've got the house of Judah in the south and the house of Israel in the north. And as Paul is writing, he talks about we who were the first to believe. He says in Ephesians chapter 1, and now he says in Ephesians chapter 2, therefore remember that you, once Gentiles, okay, now again, the word Gentile, coming from the Latin gen, we go take it back to the Greek, it's the ethnos, or the ethnu. And if we go back to the Hebrew, it's the goyim, and it just means the nations or the people that are outside of this covenant that God has made with the United Kingdom of Israel, the 12 tribes. And remember that 10 of the tribes were in the north, and God divorced those 10 tribes that we call the house of Israel. A nickname for them is the house of Ephraim. Okay, so that's just a nickname, but we'll get to that in a minute. So here he's talking to you, once Gentiles. So he's talking about scattered northern Israel who were out of covenant. You were once Gentiles in the flesh, that at that time you were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Yeshua, you who were once far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. Remember Hosea 1:9, for you are not my people, and I will not be your God, is what God said to the northern kingdom of Israel. He said that to the northern kingdom, not to the southern kingdom. All right, he says, you're out. I'm divorcing you. So you're now out of the commonwealth of Israel. You're now strangers from the covenants of promise. And now you have no hope. And you're without God in the world. There's no way you can come back because God isn't going to die, right? Fat chance of that. Well, guess what? He did. God himself went to the cross and died because he loves his wife. It's pretty amazing. Now, it's important to understand here that there's no such thing as this dispensation of grace. I hope you understand that the new covenant is not a new age or a so-called dispensation by those who are called dispensationalists. They would have us believe that there was the dispensation of law, that God gave the law at Mount Sinai, and you got to do this and don't do that, and if you do these things, then we'll hang out together, right? And then Jesus came and he put all of that law stuff aside. And now there's this time of grace. Well, God has always been gracious. So it's really unbiblical to say that there's an age of law and an age of grace. It's very unbiblical because Yehovah has always been operating on the basis of grace with all of humanity. Notice here in Exodus 34, Yehovah passed by before him and proclaimed, Yehovah, Yehovah, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in loyal love and faithfulness. Where did he say that? He said that on top of Mount Sinai. Even as the people were being unfaithful to him, he says that he is a gracious and compassionate God. And this is what is reiterated throughout the Bible. That's the very reason that Jonah did not want to go to the city of Nineveh, because he says that I know that you're a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in loyal love and faithfulness. He didn't want to go because he knew who God was. So this idea that there's a dispensation of law and a dispensation of grace is not in the Bible. That is something that's been invented. This is important to understand because God has always been gracious. So now we see that the new covenant is not a new means of interacting with people. It's not this new basis of grace, as if there was no grace before. I laugh because that's really quite sad. But yet that is what most people think, is that the old covenant was all about law and do's and don'ts, and God was kind of a mean God, but now he's really a nice, gracious God. No, the new covenant is not about that. It's about getting his wife back, the wife who was unfaithful to him, who was an adulteress. Now he can bring her back under a new marriage covenant. And this new marriage covenant, or renewed marriage covenant, you can translate that word chadash from Hebrew either way. It's between Yehovah and his divorced wife, who had been scattered to the nations. So we read in Deuteronomy 28, Yehovah will scatter you among the nations from one end of the earth to the other. That is, if they're not faithful to him. There you will worship other gods that neither you nor your ancestors have known, gods of wood and stone. And of course we find this in so many other places. Leviticus 26:33, Jeremiah 9:16, Jeremiah 13:24, 30:11, Ezekiel 5:10, Ezekiel 6:8, Ezekiel 20:23, chapter 22 verse 15, and 36:19. All of those different places. And we're also going to have the sisters, Oholah and Oholibah, are going to be reunited under the new marriage contract. So while Yeshua's death and resurrection resolved the divorce of Yehovah and Israel, what about Judah's southern kingdom and their relationship with Yehovah, and her relationship with her northern sister, Oholah, or Samaria, or Ephraim? So what about that? How does he stitch them back together? We have to also ask ourselves, what about Judah? Does she get a new marriage covenant? She certainly needed it based on how she defiled the land and committed adultery with stones and trees. So yeah, Judah was just as guilty of being an adulterous wife, but God never actually divorced her. So we have to understand that he was going to die for her as well. Think about Judah. Judah's adulterous conduct was actually worse than the northern kingdom. God said, yet for all this, her treacherous sister Judah has not repented, to me with her whole heart, but in pretense, says Yehovah. Then Yehovah said to me, backsliding Israel has shown herself more righteous than treacherous Judah. So yeah, Israel got divorced, Judah didn't, but Judah committed all the same and even worse offenses as the northern kingdom. So she certainly deserved to be divorced, but because of her adulterous heart and wandering eyes, which deeply hurt Yehovah, he says, I was crushed by their adulterous heart, which has departed from me. You think about that for a second. God is actually hurt, he's crushed that Israel, or that Judah, that both really would act this way. How could you do this to me? God is essentially saying, I loved you. Well, Yehovah never divorced Judah because of his promise to King David. He says, if his sons reject my law and disobey my regulations, if they break my rules and do not keep my commandments, I will punish their rebellion by beating them with a club, by their sinning by inflicting them with bruises, but I will not remove my loyal love from him, nor be unfaithful to my promise, because God made a promise to David. So both houses were guilty of adultery and of breaking the covenant. The house of Israel and the house of Judah have dealt very treacherously with me. God is speaking about both houses because they're both his wife. He says they have turned back to their iniquities, to the iniquities of their forefathers who refused to hear my words, and they've gone after other gods to serve them. The house of Israel and the house of Judah have broken my covenant which I made with their fathers. Again, he's talking about the old covenant, or the first covenant that was made there at Mount Sinai. And that covenant was a marriage covenant. So we're going to have a family reunion. The two sister nations needed to be reunited into one nation, that is, to one wife. Yehovah declared that he would in fact make a new marriage contract with both houses. He says in Jeremiah 31, 31, behold, the days are coming, says Yehovah, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Did you know that the only place that the term new covenant actually appears in all of the Hebrew Bible, that is the Old Testament, the only place that it actually appears is right here in this verse in Jeremiah 31:31. So when Jesus talked about the new covenant, and all of the New Testament writers speak of the new covenant, they're making reference back to this right here. Very significant. Well, a broken family is now going to be healed. Yehovah promised that he would join the two houses back together, as depicted in the imagery of a stick broken in two, which becomes one again. Thus says the Lord Yehovah, surely I will take the stick of Joseph, which is in the hand of Ephraim, and the tribes of Israel, his companions, and I will join them with it, with the stick of Judah, and make them one stick, and they will be one in my hand. What is God talking about? Well, again, the term Ephraim is a nickname for the northern kingdom of Israel because Jeroboam was from the tribe of Ephraim. So as the leader, as the king of this northern kingdom, it is referred to as Ephraim. And of course in the south it's often referred to as the house of David, or just sometimes David, because David is the king, and those who were still on the throne in the latter days were from the house of David. Whereas in the north they were from Ephraim. At least that's how it started. It didn't quite end that way, but that's how it started. And so he's going to take these two nations and he's going to make them one again in his hand. They're going to be one stick. So imagine a stick that's broken. He's going to put them back together. Yeshua's death on the cross annulled Judah's marriage contract because she was just as guilty. So she gets a free pass. In other words, all of those terrible things that she did have now been laid to rest as well, so that there can be a completely new marriage contract. Yeshua's death on the cross annulled Judah's marriage contract with Yehovah, and thereby allowed for the house of Judah to have a new contract with Yehovah, because their first marriage was marked by gross adultery, even though she was never divorced. Judah could have a new relationship with Yehovah, and so too could northern Israel come back into fellowship with her husband, and these two sisters could become one again. So you now have two people becoming one. And this is where Paul mentions this in Ephesians chapter 2. For he himself is our peace, who has made both one, and has broken down the middle wall of separation, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, that is, the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so as to create in himself one new man from the two. And we read in Ezekiel 37, and I will join them with it, with the stick of Judah, and make them one stick, and they will be one in my hand. So the two becoming one again. These sisters reunited. There I've got a picture of two sisters that were separated for a long time, and now they're being reunited. That's the idea here. He says Paul says, thus making peace, and that he might reconcile them, that is these two sisters, both to God in one body through the Christ. Of course, that's the body of Jesus, right, who of course died. They were married to him, and so because he died on behalf of both houses, then it's like they both died, and it says thereby putting to death the enmity. Again, he's not talking about that the laws of God were so bad and Jesus had to die to save us from the laws of God. That's what people teach, and that is so wrong. Notice in Hosea 1:11, then the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together. They're going to become one again in God's hand. Paul goes on, and he came and preached peace to you who were far off, that is, to you Gentiles, to you people in the nations, to you house of Israel, you 10 tribes who were scattered out there, and to those who were near, that is, to the Jews. For through him we, that is, we Jews and you Gentiles, both have access by one Spirit to the Father. Now, therefore, you are no longer strangers and foreigners, because they were, right? They were sent away. God said, don't come back. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. You're no longer my wife. I'm no longer your God. I will not have mercy upon your children. That's why he told Hosea, name your kids Lo Ami, Lo Ruhama, right? Because, you're not mine anymore. So Paul says, therefore you're no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints, that is the chosen ones. Who did God choose? We read that in Deuteronomy 7, verse 6. I have chosen you out of all the peoples of the earth, right? So the word choose there is the same word to choose here. And of course, God is setting somebody apart. And he says, with the saints and members of the household of God. So you people who were far away, now you're brought back in. So as a result, their joint status as adulterers was wiped away. Israel's utter hopeless situation as a divorcee was also annulled, and Judah's status as an adulterous wife was canceled. Furthermore, the house of Judah and the house of Israel have become one again, and the wall of separation between them has been removed. So the house of Israel, that is Ephraim, the Gentiles, can now return to her husband. So they're no longer aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. They're no longer of that status because of what Jesus did. Yeshua is now Israel's and Judah's peace, who has made both one and has broken down the middle wall of separation. When Yeshua, Jesus, died on the cross, he abolished in his flesh the enmity, that is, the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so as to create in himself one new man from the two, thus making peace. Remember that it wasn't the good commandments that God gave that were a problem, but it was the breaking of those. It was the breach of contract that created a problem. God's law was perfect, is perfect, but Israel's response to this marriage contract was, of course, very adulterous. And that he might reconcile them both to God in one body through the cross, thereby putting to death the enmity. You can see why Paul is so excited, because he's understanding that the good news is to both the house of Israel, who was sent away, and to the house of Judah. So Yeshua also gave good news to both the house of Israel and the house of Judah when he came and preached peace to you who were afar off and to those who were near, Paul says. Through the work of Yeshua on the cross, the two houses now both have access by one Spirit to the Father. And truly those of the house of Israel are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. So, we can now understand what Paul is talking about in Romans chapter 11. So, while the barrier to restoration has been removed because of what Jesus did, the reunification process is not complete, and as far as I can tell, will not be complete until the fullness of the nations, or Israel, comes in, as Paul explained to his Jewish brethren. For I do not desire, brethren, that is to you Jews, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Now, when I read this years ago, I started thinking, well, gosh, Israel, the Jews, they're blind, and until all we Gentile non-Jews get to come in. Well, really what I think is happening here is that we're all blind. And in other words, certainly people of Judah are blinded, but also people from the northern house of Israel who were scattered to the Gentiles are also blinded. That none of us can see, or none of us sees at all, at least. Blindness in part, right, has happened to Israel. Who is Israel at this time? Well, Israel at this time has got to be the united house, or the United Kingdom of Israel. That is the 12 tribes. We can't say just the Jews, because the Jews, or the house of Judah, represents the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, and of course we have the Levites who were floating. So you could say certainly 2 tribes, and you've got some Levites thrown in there as well. So it's not until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Well, the phrase that Paul employed comes directly out of Genesis 48:19, where Jacob prophesied over Ephraim, that is Joseph's son, but Joseph's father, refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. But truly his younger brother, that is Ephraim, shall be greater than he, that is Manasseh, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations. Now, if you look at that in the Hebrew, it's literally Melo Hagoyim. Melo Hagoyim. That's the literal phrase, and the literal translation of that is Melo means fullness, and then you have the next word. These are 2 nouns stuck together. We call these a smichut, or a construct, where you have 2 nouns acting together. And in English, we have to put the word of in between those words, because that's just how it works. So it's literally the fullness of the nations. That's the most literal translation you can get, and that's exactly what Paul said. So the fullness of the nations is a reference to all of Ephraim coming in. All of Ephraim, not Judah, but all of Ephraim coming in. That's the fullness of the Gentiles. So until that time, there's a blindness in part that is over Israel. And again, Israel at this time is the reunited kingdom, where you now have all 12 tribes that can now come back together. But there's going to be this blindness over all 12 tribes, not just the Jews, but all 12 tribes, until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. Very significant. So the renewed covenant, the new covenant, is a renewed marriage contract between Yehovah and his wife Israel. I'm speaking of the reunited house of Israel and the house of Judah. Yeshua's statement, this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins, was the blood necessary to establish the marriage covenant. And of course, his death released his unfaithful wife, that is both houses, from the curses of the broken marriage contract. And of course, it allowed for northern Israel to remarry him, and for Israel and Judah to become one nation again. That is what the new covenant is. The old covenant is that first marriage covenant that God entered into with the United Kingdom back at Mount Sinai. Both houses broke that, and of course we know that the kingdom split in 932. Then God said, I'm divorcing you, house of Israel, and he sent her away, gave her a certificate of divorce. And by doing that, he made it impossible for her to come back, because that would be an abomination if she were to come back, if he were to take her back as is. And so because he loved her so much, he was willing to come in the flesh, to go to the cross, to die, to put that first marriage contract into the grave. And she was a widow for 3 days until he rose again. And now there's a new marriage covenant. That is exciting. That is good news. Yehovah's remarriage to United Israel. Yehovah's first marriage was with his special treasure, United Israel, and his new marriage is with his special treasure, Israel and Judah, reunited. So Yeshua did all that was necessary to restore his bride, Israel, just as he promised in Hosea to Israel, whom he divorced. And he says in Hosea chapter 2, I will betroth you to me forever. Yes, I will betroth you to me in righteousness and justice, in loving kindness and mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know Yehovah. He's speaking here to the northern kingdom of Israel. So we have to understand that when we talk about the bride of Christ, is it the church? Well, yes and no. It's the church in the sense that it's the assembly, the same assembly that was in the wilderness, and that same assembly that God divorced most of her, and the other part that was equally unfaithful. It's that assembly that God married originally that he also divorced. And so now it's that same assembly that he is going to make his bride. And so that is the bride of Christ. We can call it the ecclesia, we can call it the kehillah, we can call it the assembly, but it all centers around the 12 tribes of Israel. It's not talking about some new entity that people call the church. There's the church and there's Judah. That's what many people want to say, is that there are these two different peoples with two different destinies. And some teachers would put it that that Jehovah, as they say, has his wife Israel, and Jesus has his bride, the church. But that is incorrect. There's only one God, and there's one wife, and this is the bride. Now, how does it work? Ephraim's assimilation into the nations is actually a blessing. So through the dispersion of the house of Israel to the nations, the entire world is being blessed because the house of Israel was assimilated into the nations and became one with them. So God tells us that it's going to be a great blessing. So their return is nothing other than the ingathering of the Gentiles into the kingdom, and fulfills Yehovah's original promise to Abraham that his seed would be like the stars of heavens. Then he brought him outside and said, "Look now toward heaven and count the stars if you are able to number them." And he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." Yehovah's regathering the house of Israel, which was divorced, scattered, and assimilated into the nations through intermarriage, is nothing less than the house of Israel, or the Gentiles, or non-Jews, receiving by faith the fact that Yeshua graciously died to annul the first marriage covenant, which they were in bondage to, and then resurrected to lovingly take her back under a new marriage covenant. So the point is that any non-Jew, and of course Jew, and this we'll just focus on them, any non-Jew who trusts in Yeshua is part of the fullness of the Gentiles. They are part of the mixed multitude, if you will, which was added to the children of Israel when they came out of Egypt. Let me unpack that just for a moment. What I'm saying here is that you have 10 tribes that were scattered to the nations. They didn't all die. They were taken away as slaves, and they were put into different countries, and there they had to start over. So now you have the genetic seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, these 10 tribes that are taken away, and they're scattered. And they cannot come back because they've been divorced. So what's going to happen to them? Well, there's two ways I think we can look at this. On the one hand, they're being propagated genetically. So now through intermarriage, through breeding, they are creating other people. And if we don't even want to take that route, we just want to say, well, I have no genetic link to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I personally do not know if I do or I don't. I know that I'm not part of the house of Judah. And I'm not trying to replace them. I'm not trying to take over. So I'm not part of the house of Judah. But I get to come in through the house of Israel. I get to come in because of this promise that God made via Ephraim. Now, again, whether I am genetically part of them or maybe I'm not, either way, I don't think it matters. Because we know that going out of Egypt, you had the 12 tribes and you had a mixed multitude of people. That would suggest that there were Egyptians who were also in that group, who were not genetically part of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But that was not the point, because they decided to join the nation of Israel. So either way, whether they're genetically Israel or they just make a choice to be with them, they get to be part of that. And also we need to understand that no matter how you look at it, even if you are or were part of the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it is always still a personal decision to follow God. But the point here is that because the house of Israel had been divorced and sent away, they could not come back unless they went through the Jewish door. But now there's a different door. Jesus is that door. And so we can all come in through him, not through that old covenant, which they broke. They broke this marriage covenant, but now through this new marriage covenant that is completely free and clean. It has none of the old baggage. It's all brand new. It's wonderful. So the tribes of Jacob weren't enough, God says. Yehovah said that it was not enough for Yeshua to just restore the tribes of Jacob, but that he would be salvation for the nations all over the planet. Indeed, he says, it is too small a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones of Israel. I will also give you as a light to the Gentiles, that you should be my salvation to the ends of the earth. So again, they went out, and now he's bringing them back, and then some. And Yehovah promised to bring in the outcasts of Israel and also others. When Lord Yehovah, who gathers the outcasts of the house of Israel, says, yet I will gather to him others besides those who are gathered to him. Isaiah 56, verse 8. So the other regathering prophetic scriptures, Ezekiel 11:17, 20:34, 20:41, and 28:25. Now I understand that the gathering is not complete. I get that. And that it will only be complete when Jesus sends out his angels to gather his elect to him. So at the second coming of Jesus is when we're going to have this prophecy completely fulfilled. But it is happening in slow motion right now, and when Jesus comes back, it will happen in very rapid succession. And Jesus himself said, and other sheep I have which are not of this fold, them also I must bring, and they will hear my voice, and there will be one flock and one shepherd. Now, Jesus was speaking to the Jews of his day, and he's saying, I have other sheep who are not of this fold, and I've got to bring them back so there can be one flock. Remember, at the time, the Jews thought they were the only thing that would ever be, because it had been hundreds of years since the house of Israel had been sent away. And so Jesus is letting them know that, yeah, you guys are important, but I have this other flock too, and you guys are going to be one flock, and there's going to be one shepherd. So contrary to what a lot of dispensationalists teach, is that there are two different peoples with two different destinies, that you have the Jews and you have the church. That's not what Jesus said. That's not what anybody said. And the part that makes the difference is that when we understand the two covenants, we have to understand these two covenants. The old one and the new one, they're both marriage contracts is what they are. So Jesus also said in Matthew 15, but he answered and said, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So Jesus is coming to restore the house of Israel. And the restoration, of course, happened through his death. And Jesus said, and I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all peoples to myself. So again, the 10 tribes that were scattered throughout the world, he's going to bring them back, and even others besides them. So we can now understand how Paul could state so emphatically that there's no distinction between Jew, that is the house of Judah, and the Greek, which would be a circumlocution for the Gentiles, and that is, of course, where the house of Israel was scattered, which God predicted in Hosea chapter 9, verse 17, that they would become wanderers among the Gentiles. So this is why he says there's no distinction. There are no longer two houses. There's only one house. It's reunited. For the same Yehovah over all is rich to all who call upon him. So the house of Israel and the house of Judah have been restored into one nation and one wife. So Paul witnessed the reunification of the two houses. Thus says the Lord Jehovah, surely I will take the stick of Joseph, which is in the hand of Ephraim, and the tribes of Israel, his companions, and I will join them with it, with the stick of Judah, and make them one stick, and they will be one in my hand. And the sticks on which you write will be in your hand before their eyes. So again, you have these two sticks that used to be one. They're broken. He's going to bring them back together to be one stick in his hand. And Paul got to witness this, which is why he was so excited. Then say to them, thus says Lord Jehovah, surely I will take the children of Israel from among the nations, wherever they have gone, and will gather them from every side and bring them into their own land. And I will make them one nation in the land, on the mountains of Israel, and one king shall be king over them all. They shall no longer be two nations, nor shall they ever be divided into two kingdoms again. Now again, I understand this is not completely fulfilled. I get that. But we've seen the inception. It was all made possible by the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Jesus, who came as the husband of both of these houses. He then died to lay aside that first covenant that they broke because they were not faithful to him. They went whoring after these other gods. So he died. That marriage covenant was put into the grave. For 3 days, both houses were a widow. And then Jesus came back from the dead as the same guy, but legally a new entity. He's legally a new entity so that there can be this new marriage covenant. It's amazing. The new covenant is Jehovah restoring the house of Judah and Israel into one nation, which was made possible by the death of Yeshua. Now, how do you get into this? It is always by a personal decision, that you are acknowledging what Jesus did, and that you're claiming that as sufficient for your own personal life. I've been explaining what's been happening on a national level. And there are other pieces to this puzzle as well. I'm not saying that the restoration of the two houses is the only thing that happened at the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. But for this study, that's what we've been focused on. There's other things that Jesus' death did for us. It's going to in the future, and it will restore planet Earth. It will restore us to have a new body, okay, and it will even restore the separation. It'll take away the separation between heaven and earth, between the domain of God and the domain of man. So all those things are going to be restored in time, and those were, of course, made possible because of what Jesus did, but we do not see those actually in progress yet. Well, that is the end of part 1. We're then going to discuss the election of the sons of Jacob.